There are moments sometimes when I feel like I'm just being pulled out of this world and traveling into a higher dimension. Now, this sounds a little bit sort of like a fantasy, but it really does feel like everything around me just stops. It feels like there's not a room for a single thought anymore. There's not a room for this body anymore, this image, this illusion. And I'm sure some of you have experienced this as well, right? It's not something that is unique to myself or unique to others who are traveling this spiritual journey. I think it's something where, for those of us who have at least spent some time, traveling the journey inward, there comes moments throughout the day where you have, I was reading recently Paramahansa Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi, where you have kind of this state of samadhi or this state of communion with the divine, communion with God. And sometimes this experience can feel so intense, like you feel, the classic example or the description that I give people is I get these goosebumps. I get chills running throughout my whole body. I feel like all of a sudden I'm sort of formless. I'm as thin as air. And again, it's very hard to describe in person, but it just reminds me that this is something that we should all be striving towards. And we should not only be striving to experience once or twice, but rather we should make this sort of second nature, sort of a part of who we are. One of the things that I like to talk about a lot is that no matter how busy we get in life, and trust me, we do get busy in this life. There's a lot of roles and responsibilities and commitments, things that inevitably will fill up our entire day. But no matter how busy we get in this life, we need to always hold on to what matters most. And in this case, what matters most is a connection with the divine, a connection with God. So when I talk about this traveling into a higher dimension, it's important to first realize what dimension we are in right now. When we talk about dimensions in physical terms, we obviously are referring to things like width and height and length, or even non-spatial dimensions like time, right? We don't typically go beyond sort of those scientific dimensions. We typically, things that we can measure, things that we can describe. But what are the attributes of spiritual dimensions? How do we classify those? How do we understand those? How do you measure progress on the spiritual journey? How do you measure progress toward traveling towards your heart, towards traveling towards your core? You see, when it comes to trying to understand and analyze these things, the mind can be pretty useless. But that's by design, right? It's by design that the mind cannot understand these things. And so the thing that we have built up all these years, the mind, the intellect, the source of reason, the source of knowledge, the thing that we've continued to add and add and add to, well, that's no longer going to serve us. It's no longer going to help us at this juncture on the journey. We need to rely on something else. We need to rely on someone else. So instead of the ego and instead of the mind, instead of the unconsciousness that we often find ourselves sucked into, it's now time to trust and rely on a higher power, something that we know deep within our core exists, but maybe we've either ignored or forgotten it or shunned it or moved it to the side. whatever it might be, it's now time to welcome that presence back into our lives. Of course, it's never left, right? That's, I think, the part that we sometimes miss when we talk about things like going through a dark night of the soul, when we talk about things like hitting rock bottom, having depression, going through so many different challenges in life. We sometimes think that we're all alone on this journey, that, oh my goodness, I hear a lot of times people say, like, I'm struggling to connect with God. I can't find God. Well, the truth is, God is there. What we should actually be saying is, there's a layer in front of me that's preventing me from seeing God. And this layer or this veil is self-created, is mind-created. It's made by the mind. God is always there, even in your deepest despair, even in your deepest troubles. God is right there. Presence is right there. And so it's really just a matter of shifting your perspective, shifting your awareness, shifting the dimension on which you see and live in. So, I was thinking about, kind of what topics I should cover next on my videos, and I thought this one was perhaps one of the more interesting ones. Not to say that the other videos aren't interesting, but while some of the other ones might offer kind of more specific, concrete, or practical suggestions on ways to live a better, more peaceful, more spiritual life, this one's a little bit more philosophical. It's a little bit more metaphysical, a little bit more, requires more of your imagination, requires more of, your willingness to kind of let go of your reason, let go of your intellect, and to try to think like an artist does, or a poet, or anyone else that's kind of tapping into the creative source or the creative spark that is God. There's things that just sometimes can't be explained through words. They can't be explained through rules. They can't be explained through logic, but you know in your core that this is the truth, this is the reality, right? And this is why it's no surprise that a lot of the world's ancient wisdom and ancient teachings is not in verse. I'm sorry, it's not in prose, it's in verse, it's in poetry, it's in poetic lines. You read a lot of, the classic example for me, of course, is Rumi, who, I've done a lot of videos on most of his poems, or a lot of his poems, and it's not so much to enjoy the poetry per se, but more so to extract the spiritual wisdom. And there's a lot of spiritual wisdom. There's people that have spent their entire lives trying to understand and disseminate and share Rumi's wisdom. But what I'm trying to do here is, I understand that poetry is also an art form too. It's not only a medium of sharing spiritual knowledge, but it's also an art form. And unfortunately, in today's world, perhaps this art form is not as appreciated as it once was. And maybe indirectly, that's one of the reasons why I've sort of naturally gravitated, this channel away from videos specifically on poetry to now kind of more direct, practical, spiritual talks. But on this topic of traveling a higher dimension, you really can't talk in plain, simple terms. It's something that, I don't want to say you either get it or you don't get it, but it's something that you really have to experience for yourself. You really have to feel it within your core, feel it within your soul, and know what it's like to actually ascend. Now, I'm not going to go as as far as to say that experiencing or accessing a higher dimension is akin to experiencing an awakening. As I mentioned, there's many dimensions on the spiritual plane, on the spiritual world. I'm not sure anyone understands what they are, let alone myself, who is candidly still experiencing this journey, still learning, still growing, still, trying to see what really is there. But I think it's important for us to at least prod, to at least poke around and discover and explore and really test the boundaries of where we can go, right? When you talk about human potential, well, the potential of a human is probably limited, but the potential of a person who accesses the divine is unlimited because the divine is unlimited. The potential of God is unlimited. So when we think about this, when we try to kind of wrap our minds around, accessing this higher dimension, we have to sort of think first off, where is this higher dimension ultimately leading to? Right? And the answer is, of course, God. We're in essence building a bridge, building a path from our heart directly to God. And there's so many different ways to experience this. I talked about, at the beginning of this video, how I sometimes experience it. It can sometimes come in the most unexpected places and situations, right? I could be driving down the street, picking up groceries, and all of a sudden, something about the way I'm looking at the road or the trees or the cars, the sky, something just kind of takes me out of this world for a moment. Now, of course, I have to be careful, right? Because when you're driving, you have to, make sure that your full attention is on the road and safety first and things like that. But sometimes you do get that feeling, and it's hard to resist. The curious part of me just wants to go more, wants to go further, wants to see, well, where can this take me? Where does this road go? And the more you experience it, the more you want to go even deeper. But you also have to keep in mind that it's not something that you can force. Every part of the journey has its own place, has its own time. And you can only advance to the next stage of the journey. You can only access the next dimension. You can only learn the next lesson once the time is ripe for you to do so. It's kind of like that spiritual teaching that you hear often that, the teacher arrives when the student is ready. The teaching arrives when the student is ready. And sometimes it's hard for us to know if we're ready or not, right? I look at myself, for example, it feels like, looking back at kind of how I got here today, the road that I've traveled on my spiritual journey leading up to today, there's clearly moments where I see tremendous growth. But then there's also periods of time, long periods of time, where it feels like I'm kind of stagnating. I'm not really progressing. I'm not really going forward. There's even some moments where I feel like I'm going backwards. And so how much of this is actually real, and how much of this is just a projection of my mind? How much of this is my own ego still trying to fight back, still trying to rein in and take control again and make sure that I don't progress any further? But then when I, am able to really be still and look at the grander scheme of things and to pay close attention, I'm able to see that there are very, very small shifts taking place. They may not be large, right? They may not be easily noticeable, but there's little small things that get improved day by day, day by day, day by day. This year in particular for me has been a year of transformative changes, from how I set positive habits, to not worrying about things as much as before, to spending more time with my family and just enjoying life more and not being as serious as much, not, trying to plan every detail out, not trying to know what goes on, and not worrying as much either. It's, I don't know if many of you guys have seen this movie yet, but there was a movie my wife and I watched a couple of weeks ago called Inside Out 2. And I don't want to, provide any spoilers for those of you who haven't watched it yet, but it's a Disney movie. And it shows kind of the emotions of, I think she's a 16-year-old, but these emotions are like cartoon characters that have a life and mind of their own. So there's joy, and then there's anger, and there's sadness. And of course, this is the sequel, so there's new emotions because this girl is now entering puberty. So there's things like boredom, there's things like envy, there's things like anxiety. And without giving too much away into the movie, we see how these emotions, particularly some of the stronger emotions like anxiety, just take over. And, you know, and speaking from my own situation as someone who has had a lot of anxiety in the past, has had, multiple panic attacks, I could resonate so well how devastating anxiety can be. Even till this day, believe it or not, there's still some moments where if I'm not paying attention, if I'm not mindful, anxiety will get the best of me. But, going back to this year being such a sort of transformative year, that's one of the things that I've really worked on myself, is just being able to create this distance. I am not my anxiety. I am not, this worrier of what will happen in the future or what I need to do to create this made up view of a perfect future. I can only do what's there in front of me, and I will do it to the best of my ability. But other than that, the rest is up to God. The rest is up to the universe. I am only one part of an infinite, chain of events that needs to occur. So accessing this higher dimension, some of it comes from the work that we do to, the self work that we do, whether it's, as I was describing with myself, whether it's creating positive habits, whether it's meditating more and becoming more still, whether it's letting go of negative tendencies or negative thought patterns. Some of it is in our control, but some of it is not. And some of it just requires a bit of a patient outlook, a bit of a patient perspective, being ready, being primed, because as I mentioned, it doesn't always pour out smoothly or consistently. There's sort of flashes along the journey that can really provide a step function in our growth. We can grow a little bit each and every day. We can, make small, steady improvements, but then sometimes you can see there's a massive spike, and that's because we access a higher dimension. We unveil a form of wisdom that we previously were not seeing before. So when it comes to accessing this higher dimension, maybe you've already experienced it, maybe you've already seen it, but if you're at the point now where you're looking for the next one, just be careful of that, because sometimes, like the rest of life, right? Like the materialistic lives that many of us sometimes lead. Once we get something, we want the next great thing. We want to experience the next high. We want to experience sort of the next sort of elation. After experiencing that divine union, we then all of a sudden are brought back into reality. And that can be very painful for a lot of us, because we experience such joy, such bliss, such immense elation and fulfillment, and then all of a sudden we feel sad, we feel depressed, we feel neglected, we feel alone. So how do we navigate that? So these are some of the questions that I hope as you're listening to them, you're sort of kind of letting it percolate and simmer in your mind, in your being, in your core, because these are things that candidly, they don't have a clear black and white answer. This video doesn't have like a clear beginning and end. There's this journey will continue. Certainly as I experience it more, I hope that I can share and be in a position to share more insights and more tips and more guidance and anything that I can do to help all of you who are watching progress even further on your spiritual journey. And likewise, I love hearing your comments. I love hearing your own personal stories and experiences. They give me inspiration. They give me a seed of positivity that I can then carry on with me, especially in the days when things can sometimes feel challenging. They can feel mundane. They can feel like, you're not making any progress at all, but in truth you are. And that's sometimes the hardest thing to realize. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I would definitely love to hear your thoughts if you've had your own experience with a higher dimension. If you have any sort of tips and strategies for how you dealt with it, how you embraced it, how you deal with the periods where maybe you're back to a lower dimension or maybe kind of back to things as normal. I certainly would love to hear your thoughts on that, and maybe it can help others who are watching this video as well. But please don't hesitate to drop a like if you enjoyed the video. Also, feel free to check out some of the other videos on the channel. But I wish you a wonderful day or evening ahead, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video.